My name is Alana Thane, and I'm a professor at McGill University. And along with Alex Kaminska, who's also here today, I'm co-director of the Sociability of Sleep, a research creation project focused on the equities and epistemologies of sleep. And I'm delighted to be here with you and our wonderful lineup of speakers. Thank you so much to Reiss for helping pull this together. Our session will be recorded, and please feel free to leave your camera off. And when we post it on the website, we'll also make sure that it has captions. And I think we can also turn on captioning now as well. I'm going to begin today with a land acknowledgement. The Sociability of Sleep project is physically located in Jojagi, Munyang, Montreal, and is situated on the traditional unceded territories of the Ganyangahaga. We recognize with gratitude they are the traditional custodians of the lands and water on which we meet, live, and rest. Jojage has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst many First Nations, including the Ganyangahaga of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, Abenaki, and Anishinaabe peoples. And I'll also share an acknowledgement developed by the feminist media studio at Concordia for pandemic forms of assembly, that while Zoom, a company that has exploded in value during the pandemic, is the technical custodian of the platforms on which we gather, this makes us no less occupants of the multiple territories on which we're physically located. Zoom's headquarters are located in Mawekma Ohlone territory, and the Ohlone have historically understood about sustainability, communal societies, about giving gifts to those who pass by, and about sharing space. All themes which I think are particularly relevant to our event here today. We see Zoom as a platform which both connects us and which can alienate us from the aims of restitution, justice, and reparation. I'd also like to acknowledge that the Sociability of Sleep is supported by funding from the Government of Canada's New Frontiers and Research Funds. And today's event is part of an expanded series called Altered States, funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. On our website, and we can share the link in the Zoom, you can sign up for our newsletter. You can find out more about upcoming events, such as a talk next week by artist Shubi Cheng on her sleep series, and our next sleep salon next Thursday with Jean Ma and Kara Chulu, and our current artists in residence as well, as we work towards an exhibition here in Montreal in June, July called Ensemblance. Please reach out if you're interested in learning more or collaborating. And most of all, thanks so much for being here. There'll be a Q&A after our speakers, and you can either post questions in the chat or you can turn on your camera and ask questions. Today's conversation is in English, but please feel free to ask any questions or make comments in French, and we're happy to translate. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our moderator, Dr. Diletta De Cristofaro. Dr. De Cristofaro is a Wellcome Trust-funded research fellow at Northumbria University and director of the Writing the Sleep Crisis project. She researches and writes about contemporary literature and culture, and her narratives explore crises and what these narratives tell us about our society, our sense of self, and of time. And she's an expert in the apocalyptic imagination. Her book on the topic, Contemporary Post-Apocalyptic Novel, Critical Temporalities and the End Times, was published with Bloomsbury, while her current book project explores the cultural politics of the sleep crisis, namely today's presumed widespread sleep deprivation, and is funded by the Wellcome Trust and the European Commission. And in 2023, she was also shortlisted as a BBC New Generation thinker. Dr. De Cristofaro is also the keynote speaker at the Sociability of Sleep's Summer Graduate Conference, Somnambulations 2. If you are interested in joining that for us, or if you have great students who'd be interested in presenting their work, technically the deadline was the 15th, but we're happy to accept proposals in the days to come. And I'll put a link to that as well. I'll turn it over now to Dr. De Cristofaro to introduce our speakers. And again, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much, Alana, and good to see everybody. Welcome to this World Sleep Day Roundtable. And I just wanted to say, first of all, again, thank you to Reiss, but also to Alana and Alex for organizing this event and this wonderful panel. I'm really excited to be moderating it. So we have 6 panelists today: Sarah Barnes, Benjamin Reiss, Kelton Minor, Devon Bate, Jayson Porter, and Arun Kumar, who will present their thoughts on the relationship between sleep and climate change from their varied disciplinary perspectives. And I'm really excited to hear from each of them. So I will introduce them in turn. They will each speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have a panel discussion and Q&A session. So as Alana said, please feel free to pop your questions in the chat at any point. I'll make sure we return to them, or once we get to the Q&A, if you'd rather just ask your question directly, raise your virtual hand and I'll give you the floor. So I was asked to say a little bit about my own interest in the relationship between sleep and climate change. So I'll do that, but really, really quickly, and then we'll get to our panelists. So as Alana has mentioned, I am the principal investigator on this research project, which is called Writing the Sleep Crisis, which basically explores representations of sleep and sleeplessness, in particular this idea of the sleep crisis in contemporary literature and culture. So broadly speaking, my research focuses on narratives engaging with crisis. So in my current research on sleep, I'm trying to bring together as well what I was doing in my previous book project, which was about the apocalypse. And of course, in that project, there was a lot about the climate crisis. So I'm trying to trace kind of points of contact between the climate crisis and this idea of the sleep crisis, which, as I'm sure many of you know, is relatively contested actually, but still one of the main ways that contemporary literature and culture really thinks about sleep in the contemporary moment. So my work explores issues of affect, on the one hand, the kind of affective impacts of the climate crisis on sleep. So the so-called eco-anxiety, for instance, which often manifests through insomnia. But also I'm interested, on the other hand, in the relationship really between bodily and environmental exhaustion today, especially in relation to practices of extractive capitalism on human and planetary resources. So without further ado, let me introduce our first two panelists who are presenting together. So Sarah Barnes is assistant professor in the Department of Experiential Studies in Community and Sport at Cape Breton University. A former athlete herself, Barnes has published on the regulations of sleep in professional athletics, the NBA and NFL, exploring race, technology, and the commodification of rest. Devon Bate is a music producer and sound designer currently writing a master's thesis in media studies at Concordia University. Beginning in a 2015 artistic residency with the UU Artists Association in Helsinki, he has been creating work that interrogates how culturally and technologically informed listening practices shape physical space, community, and identity. He's currently researching background noise and ambient audiovisual media on popular streaming platforms. So Sarah and Devon, the floor is yours. We can't hear you, Sarah.
Hi, thank you very much. Devon and I have prepared a script for today, and we're going to sort of split the time. So I'm going to begin speaking, and then halfway through, Devon will take over. And I'm hoping that I remember to change the slides. So Lacey lives in Port Morion, a remote coastal village on the southeastern side of Unama'ki, or Cape Breton Island. On July 15th, she awoke to a noise. Lacey searched the house, trying to figure out what appliance was running. It sounded like the dishwasher or the tumble dryer. It had a low hum, a rumble to it, but it wasn't an appliance. It wasn't even in our house. Life used to be peaceful, quiet. The sound of the sea, mesmerizing cliffs that smooth out into a daisy chain of sheltered coves and sandy beaches, a seemingly unending line of trees, tall, dark, and dense, a sky that is constantly changed by whatever is blowing in from the north or the south. The infrastructure of Port Morion is sparse, an echo of what it used to be before the decline of fishing, before the decline of heavy industry. There is a single two-lane highway that winds along the water's edge. It's crossed by 6 streets: Amy, Birch, Breakwater, Cliff, Hanaway, and Backpit Road. The village square, there's a village square, 3 churches, one of which has regular services, a post office, a fire hall, 8 heritage markers that commemorate the past. There are no grocery stores, restaurants, or pubs. The only public school was closed in 2017 due to low enrollments. The best place to find a beer is at the Legion. The best place to catch a sunrise is on the sandbar, where early morning hues of pink and peach and red and gold stretch right out across the bay. But to say Port Morion is a sleepy village would be cruel, given their current predicament. Residents here have been exposed to low-frequency industrial noise emitted in the process of ventilating methane gas from the Donkin Mine, the last under-ocean coal mine in the world. It has wreaked havoc on the sleep of many in the village. It has been going for more than 1,000 days. The Sleep, Sound, and Community Welfare Project is in collaboration with the Cowbay Environmental Coalition. Some members are here today, including Kat Ferguson and Sarah Clapstein. Hi, everybody. Last summer, we interviewed 18 residents impacted by the noise. Today, we weave their voices together with an emerging story about the weight of an industrial past, the present-day power of the fossil fuel industry, and questions about whose sleep matters and whose sleep is seen as worthy of protection. Port Morion, it must be said, is no stranger to coal. This region has been shaped by centuries of exchange and conflict among the Micmac of Cape Breton, French, British, and later Canadian settlers. A political economy anchored in extractive industries was built here upon European imaginations of a hostile frontier and empty land. Still today, celebrations of coal, labor, and class struggle are never far from reach. June 11th, or Davis Day, is a provincial holiday in memory of those who have perished in coal mines. Its namesake, William Davis, was a 38-year-old coal miner on strike in 1925 when he was fatally shot in New Waterford by the Dominion Steel and Coal Company's police force. Every summer, thousands flock to Glace Bay's Miner Museum, where visitors can take guided tours of a mine shaft or visit replicas of the company house or a company store. Men of the Deeps, North America's only coal miner chorus, are a fixture at public events. Most recently, they performed at a coal mining heritage night hosted by the Screaming Eagles, Sydney's major junior hockey team. The Donkin Mine sponsored the night, and together with representatives of the mine and the Miners Museum, they led a ceremonial puck drop. This is just a glimpse of the immense weight and power of public memory and the way that sporting formations, Canada's national game, can be so instrumental in shoring up the settler, colonial, and capitalist projects that underwrite coal mining, and indeed the entwined crises of sleep and climate that bring us here today. And all of this is to say, it was not totally surprising when several members of the community made it clear in their interviews, they were not anti-coal or anti-job, they simply wanted the noise to stop. It was conceivable, reasonable even, for most of the community to assume it would be business as usual when Cameron Collieries, a subsidiary of the US-based Klein Group, reopened the Donkin Mine in 2017. The then American billionaire owner, Chris Klein, suggested that within a decade, the site could be earning $500 million annually. Of note, Klein and 6 others died in a helicopter crash in the Bahamas in 2019. But things did not go as most in the community had hoped. From the get-go, the jobs were precarious and dangerous. 12 roof falls, a methane fire, 152 warnings, 119 compliance orders, 37 administrative penalties, and several provincial work stop orders accumulated in about 3 years. Due to adverse geological conditions, Cameron Coal shifted the mine into a care and maintenance stage in March 2020. All operations halted, but the equipment was never removed. A skeleton crew dewatered and maintained the site. Day and night, night and day, the ventilation system kept this mine viable by releasing methane into the atmosphere. Production resumed in early fall of 2020. The exact date is hard to know. The why is more obvious. The war in Ukraine had driven the price of coal up, reaching $397 US per ton in July, heights not seen in recent memory.
Thanks, Sarah. One participant describes that if it was a solid sound, you know what? It wouldn't even be that bad. It's at a pitch that's just maddening. The drone kind of gets louder. It drives me insane. At first, it wasn't too bad. So not everyone in the village perceives the industrial noise in the exact same way. The absence of a universal experience is, of course, unsurprising and mirrors the current literature around sound and listening. Sensitivity to noise is shaped by a mixture of personal, contextual, and cultural factors alongside the sound itself, the volume, frequency, and duration of the sound. Yet many of the people have similar stories about the noise entering their homes and settling into their bodies. Sometimes people said the noise felt like a weight, an ache, or a tension that became lodged in their jaws or ears or chest. Headaches, daytime fatigue, and brain fog were all common. It's been so loud that it just feels like it hurts, you know. Your teeth are aching and your ears are aching. Sometimes it's really loud. Sometimes I used to get this tension headache because I was clenching my jaw. It's a low drone that just aggravates you, torments you. So this industrial noise interrupts and damages people's sleep. Another one says, the noise can actually wake you right out of your sleep, and you stay there listening to this very annoying sound. It's worse than fingernails down a blackboard. I get a couple hours sleep, and then the noise wakes me up. Well, then I'm awake. You're constantly awakening, trying to fall asleep, trying to go to sleep, stressed out, then you can't sleep. Some nights I go to bed, I sleep for 1 hour, and then I wake. Even if I'm not hearing the line, I'm anticipating it. So the noise itself haunts the locals. This haunting quality permits some to become fixated on the noise and to become preoccupied by if and when it will return. Perhaps as significant as the noise itself is that it is present even in its absence. An insidious dimension of the noise is that people are often coping with it late at night or early in the morning, a problem that is totally beyond their own personal control. One resident described feeling suicidal from the ongoing aggravation of the noise. These stories of suffering and sleep loss become even more alarming in a moment where a growing amount of biomedical research shows that lost and fragmented sleep is linked to diminished health outcomes, accidents, and workplace injuries. Though the noise is a shared community problem, often there's no choice but to seek out personal solutions. For some, this has included the use of medications. One person with no prior history of medication or drug use described the steps he took to become more functional after so much lost sleep. States, I'm not one to take pills and stuff all the time, but in the last year, I've taken over 400 extra strength Tylenol. If that doesn't work, I have to take Tylenol 3. Tylenol 3 has opioids, just like fentanyl. And no less harmful were the ways that people survived by adjusting their daytime routines. Penny tried to mask the noise by arranging her house. At night, she shut the windows that faced the ocean and the mine. William used earplugs. Grace turned up the radio. Evelyn leaves the television on. Patricia stopped gardening. Bill and Anne stopped sitting on their lawn in the summer. These solutions were rarely effective. As Fran explained, even with earplugs, sometimes I can still hear the walls vibrating from it. So low frequency noise is harder to block out than other types of noise because it's composed of physically longer wavelengths that are less changed by physical barriers. The inability to do anything about this particular type of sound exacerbates the anxiety around the listener's relationship to the sound. And unfortunately, increasingly popular sleep aids like white noise machines are physically less effective at masking this type of pitched, low frequency noise. So these small and mundane changes in people's lives add up to something larger. Day-to-day alterations were often accompanied by a profound sense of grief and loss. It was not unusual for the interviewees to become distressed in reflecting on how their homes and lives had changed since the noise had arrived. Many articulated how their lives had been diminished and made smaller. After enduring years of this low frequency noise, it's no wonder that participants used words like depleted, tired, fragile, and exhausted to describe the state of their community. We're tired of fighting. There's tiredness here. It's just wearing us down, explained one participant. Another said, The low frequency noise had the effect of depleting our resources and depleting our communities and the vibrancy of our community, making us poor in so many ways. Thanks, that's it for me.
Thank you so much, both. That was really fascinating, and I'm sure we'll have loads of questions about it. So yeah, again, feel free to pop your questions in the chat, and then we'll get to them. But now I want to introduce our next panelist, who is Arun Kumar, an assistant professor of history at the University of Nottingham. He's a historian of modern India with an interest in social, economic, education, and labor history. His work explores different facets of working class life histories, including their dreams, education, nighttime histories, and childhood. He's currently working on his first book project, tentatively titled The Silent Rebellion, Working Class Dreams, Education, and Welfare Capitalism. Arun, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Diletta, and everyone who is here. I am a historian, as Diletta said. I work on colonialism, and I'm a historian of India. I'm going to share my thoughts on history, colonialism, and ecological limits of sleep. This is something that has come from my research, which spreads across social, labor, educational, and the history of night. So I'm going to make 5 points in this presentation, very simple points, but nevertheless, yeah, they can be complicated. So the first point is that sleep, as we know, is more than $1 billion industry. I think it used to be long back, but I think it's probably more now. And why is that? And it's precisely the fact that we are a sleep deficient society. People have been sleeping less than 7 to 8 hours. There are several surveys which have been conducted in American context and the British context, and they all suggest that there is a pattern of sleep deficiency and broken sleep, which is also the quality of the sleep. I want to go to a very old survey which was done in the 1919 by the sleep specialist William Charles Dement, who was an American scholar, researcher, and he made fundamental, very revealing points. Point 1, he said that people on average sleep 1.5 hours less each night, and then they would have done a century ago, meaning our predecessors, our ancestors were sleeping more. The second point that he basically made was that there is an epidemic of sleep deprivation in our midst, meaning that people are not sleeping that much. So there is an epidemic of that. There are many people who are without sleep. And the final point that he makes or concludes is that most people in advanced industrial societies, as a consequence, are walking around with an accumulated sleep deficit of between 25 to 30 hours. So he made these conclusions based on his survey that he conducted towards the end of the last century. But these points, they kind of make sense if you look at the market of the sleep. So the sleep has been commodified. In the market, you can find sleeping pills, special pillows, bedding, self-help books, sleep-inducing drinks, sleep apps, sleep music, coolers, air conditioners, heaters to induce sleep. What's interesting is that historical research suggests a very different pattern in terms of sleep. So in the context of Western societies, there is a historian, Roger Ackirk, who made a point that people are sleeping differently than what the medieval folks would have been sleeping. So for example, he made a point that the modern people, the people from 19th century onwards, are sleeping in a single phase instead of the earlier people who slept in 2 phases, of what he called biphagic sleep. So they would sleep in 2 halves from, let's say, 8 to 12 and then take a break of 1 or 2 hours where they'll meditate or make love or have a drink and then sleep again. But because of the industrial capitalism and the work ethics, the sleep has been segmented into one section. So people taking a longer sleep from, let's say, 9 to 5 or 6. And that trend, according to him, is continuing, and which we can see in various urban and industrial areas, that sleep is more or less getting bracketed. So there is a lot of pressure on sleep due to industrial work ethics that have been evolving since the late 19th century. And we are using weekends quite often to meet our sleep deficits. So that's my first point, that there's a sleep market that has emerged. Now, the second point that I want to make is climate change and sleep. Is that climate change is real, increased temperatures, glaciers are melting, increased frequency of droughts, extreme heats, fire, and uneven seasons. Many animals are extinct or on the verge of it. Flora and fauna has significantly changed in the last 500 years, which has been precipitated by the exploitation of colonialism and modern industrial capitalism, something that the last presentation highlighted. So now the environment or the nature is just no longer a separate entity, rather it has become a political issue. It has become, it has put limits on capitalism, and it has also forced to kind of raise the question how politics should be governed, how people should be governed at the moment. And we're seeing different kind of actions being taken by these international organizations like UN. But what's the link with the sleep? And I was reading a paper in the Lancet, which came in 2022, last year, by Chen He and Ho Kim and others, and they were trying to make a sense on the effects of nighttime warming on mortality. And they were trying to kind of gather data from East Asian countries, China, Japan, and Korea. And they surveyed and studied death data of 9.1 million in 28 cities. And they concluded, the main conclusion was that the mortality rates were higher by 50% on hot nights. So people were dying more if there were intense heat nights. So they were making another point that the intensity of hot nights and the frequency of hot nights, if they are increased in the future, it is possible that the intensity of hot nights would, according to them, increase by 50% by the end of by the end of this century, and the frequency of hot nights would also increase by 30%. And that they're saying that would have an impact directly on the sleep. The question is then how to kind of understand this in historical perspective. As a historian, I think I would leave how sleep affects or the environment affects sleep, or sleep is kind of affected by the climate change actions or climate change. I will leave it to my scientist friends because they're more capable of doing that. I want rather to go in the past and make sense of history and ecological limits of sleep. From what I've said, I think it makes sense that there are environmental limits of sleep, and environment does put a limit to our sleep. But let's go back in the past and see and how it makes sense in a particular historical context. And I want to take the case of India here, which is what my research is on. So in India, where the hot weathers are quite extreme, including the winter weathers in the north, they're also quite extreme. People slept and continued to sleep in phases. So napping is a frequent exercise that people take in both urban and rural areas, depending on the work that they do. So extreme hot weathers break the sleep constantly, and people, as a result, they rely on taking naps in between. In the last summer, when there was a heat wave in the UK, I wrote a piece on the violence of sleep and colonialism. And it is my assumption that if nights will continue to be hot, it is possible that our patterns of sleep will also change in the future. daytime napping would become more and more frequent due to the problems of sleep associated with hot nights. And here I want to kind of go a little bit in the history that is of British India. India was a colony of England from 1757 to 1947. And a lot of archive that has been generated around sleep, which has not been looked by historians, because possibly we're not asking the sleep question to the history in the South Asian case. So the British and European settlers in India could not sleep well for at least half of the year, from mid-April to early November. The Indian summer, combined with mosquito bites, flies, and occasional storms paralyzed their sleeping pattern, which has resulted in an archive of frequent mentions of sleep disturbances, frustration from incessant sweat and pupillus, and complaints of the climate. As a result, a whole economy of sleep infrastructure is developed, particular type of bedding, clothing, high ceiling, night foods, and a large army of fan puller servants, the domestic servants who would keep the rooms cool by pulling the pankha, the fan, this cotton, which is the cotton cloth, which is put in frames to make airs, and it needed lots of labor. And it is this extraction of labor from these domestic servants, these pankha pullers, that becomes this frequent archive of complaints from the British people. And these people, they also become subject to violence in this period if they fail to pull pankhas in the middle of the night. Quite often, these people were also sleepless because they were working constantly for 8 to 12 hours, or sometimes even 16 hours. Usually, a household or even an office would need 2 sets of pankha pullers who would pull the pankha for at least 18 hours in batches. So the story that emerges is that it is a story of constant labor extraction and labor evasion between the master and the domestic servant. And here is one of the masters saying about this struggle, and here I quote, "The pankhawalas, the domestic servants, plagues one almost to death. You have 2 sets of these men, 1 set for the day, 1 set for night. Yet they are such cheats that your night men will let themselves out by the day and then come to you at night half dead for want of sleep. They pull your pankha till you fall asleep and then stop, lie down, or go to sleep themselves. By and by you awake with a start and are wet through with perspiration, and lo, the pankha hangs listlessly above one's head. Then one gives it a pull, and sometime it starts the fellow up, and he pulls it till you're again dozing off and then stops. By this time, one's temper gets started, and out of bed he flies, and out he goes and finds the pankha man stretched out on a cool marble pavement, asleep and snoring. Well, you give him a good kick or resounding slap on the side of his head, at the same time calling him Suwar ka bacha, which is like son of a pig. So this sleep and the extreme heat, the nights, the weathers, it created this edifice of violence around sleep, which kind of required not the extraction of labor, but also the constant supervision of labor and various violent methods to control this labor who's pulling the pankha so that the room can be kept at a normal temperature. So what emerges from this is that the sleep is not so much about the quantity, it is about quality, the brokenness or the unbrokenness of the sleep. And it is this aspect of sleep that is most vulnerable to extreme weathers, whether it is rain or flood, winters or heat. Sleep is never distributed equally, and that's the final point that I want to make. It is differentiated on gendered lines, class lines, and occupational lines. Perhaps in the discussion, I could elaborate these points. Take the example of immigration. We have been living in an age of global migration for the last 200 years. People sleep differently in different sleep environment. However, when they change their abode, or they move out, or they're forced to move out because of war or because of climate crisis or because of because of economic forces, they have to adopt and readapt their sleep patterns also. So impacts of the climate change, though do not differentiate people, the experience of climate change has been uneven in terms of region, class, race, and caste. People on the socioeconomic margins experience worse effects because of their inability to buy comfort. So people like Pankha pullers, who had to actually sacrifice their sleep to make others sleep, that the British officials or their family to sleep. So in order to do that, they had to sacrifice their sleep. So they can't. So these poor people, the people who are on the socioeconomic margin, they cannot buy the comfort, the air conditioning, the pure water, the better insulated housing or pure air. And these battles are something that in countries like India, people are constantly fighting and are going to fight in the future. And as a result, this itself has led to commodification of these products in the market. So I would like to just conclude that the question is not whether people are sleeping enough or not. Rather, it's about who sleeps well and who does not. Who is the master of sleep and who is not. Which places people are sleeping well and which places people are not sleeping well. So these, I think, are the questions that that I think emerges from my work, which kind of links up with this climate crisis that whether we want or not is going to kind of is actually pushing our limits and asking the question that are we going to be the master of our sleep? Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Arun, for that. It was really brilliant. So as ever, any questions, pop them in the chat and we'll get to them as soon as possible. So our next speaker is Kelton Minor, who is a postdoctoral research scientist at Columbia University. He applies tools from spatial data science and computational social science to study how humans adapt to planetary changes and climate hazards. He's currently working on several projects that bridge between Columbia's Data Science Institute and Climate School to identify how meteorological and climate stressors, including heat waves and extreme precipitation, impact human behavior, sleep, and well-being at scales ranging from communities to continents. Kelton, and the floor is yours.
Thanks so much for the introduction, and I hope everyone can see the slides here. I'm going to try to sort of blur through these as fast as I can, so hang on and pardon the speed. So yeah, as was alluded to, I am currently a postdoc at Columbia University's Data Science Institute, and I'm also sort of jointly affiliated with both the Center for Behavioral Cardiovascular Health and also the new Climate School, which has been created as sort of a new experiment in interdisciplinary thinking with regards to the climate crisis and challenges that it creates. So we are kind of living in these, environments that are wildly experimental. When I say this, you could think about a city as being sort of an organism or a town, or perhaps even just the scale of the neighborhood that you live on. And these experiments are oftentimes sort of designed in a little bit of an improvised way. And if we zoom out all the way to the level of the planet, you can really see the scale of this anthropogenic experiment taking place in time and space. And I wanted to invoke this quote by Roger Revelle in 1957, well ahead of his time, where he said, "Human beings are now carrying out a large-scale geophysical experiment of a kind that could not have happened in the past, nor be reproduced in the future." And we are living through multiple large-scale experiments. The urbanization that is taking place has already sort of involved half of the human population. We expect about 66% to be living in cities as of 2050. And more people are connected to technologies that bring us together, but also cause new challenges for society that are very much rippling through the contemporary threads of today. And at the same time, we are going through these large-scale environmental changes. The world has already warmed by over 1 degree Celsius, and we expect anywhere between 1 to 5 degrees Celsius of additional warming, depending on the societal decisions that we make now and over the next few decades. So this question of, does weather and, do weather and climatic conditions actually have any impacts or implications on our health and well-being, especially our mental health, is an age-old question. You can go back in time and see this asked again and again. And if so, what might be the sort of primary mechanisms? What might be driving these connections between us and the ambient environments that we live in? And so a recent spate of literature has looked at what happens when randomly timed periods of heat are basically striking down on populations around the world. And it finds that hot periods elevate negative sentiment. It also degrades mental health. It increases local rates of suicide, not just in the US, but also in Mexico. And now more recently, evidence shows that this is consistent across much of the world. We also see that interpersonal conflict increases, tribal conflict increases, and even civil war is precipitated by periods of heat. We also know that learning and cognitive outcomes degrade in periods of hot weather. Labor productivity has been shown to decline in hot weather, and occupational injuries and just general injuries in the population has also been shown to rise during periods of hot weather, and mortality more generally. So these are a lot of very salient outcomes, but the question remains, how? How are hot temperatures actually relating to a lot of these adverse outcomes? And sleep is one of the hypotheses now that may explain at least some of what's going on. So we know from sleep literature that these exact same outcomes are sensitive from sleep restriction studies where people are randomly assigned to basically lose their sleep. And yet at the same time, this more fundamental question about ambient temperature and sleep actually, for the longest time, has been lacking really credible evidence from the real world. So outside of these sleep laboratories, we just don't know much. And one motivation for why this might be worthwhile to study is because nighttime temperatures have actually been increasing faster than daytime temperatures over the past 40 years. And so you can see this, that temperatures are rising globally, but actually taking place faster at night. There are more nighttime temperature extremes than daytime temperature extremes. And we can also see that nights are warming, not just because of climate change. More and more people are actually exposing themselves to hotter nighttime temperatures because of this sort of massive migration and relocation of the human population into urban settings that fundamentally absorb energy by day and re-release this at night. So we are actually becoming more vulnerable to these ambient changes by the way that we are shifting as a population. And you can see this from space. This is a sort of semi-urban area. If you look at it in near infrared, you basically see that the city and urban areas where humans have deposited new sort of materials onto the ground literally glow. And this is the nocturnal release of heat that I was referring to. But outside of these very controlled settings where we kind of prevent people from adapting as they normally would in the real world, we don't really know that much about what it means to be exposed to hotter temperatures in terms of our sleep patterns and rhythms. So this question remains, does it really matter if we are exposed to different hot temperatures and warming nighttime temperatures? So I'm going to talk really briefly about some findings from a global scale study that I was a part of. So this was an international team. And what we did is we linked over 10.7 billion minute-by-minute sleep state observations from accelerometer-based sleep tracking wristbands. This was an anonymized data set used in previous large-scale global sleep research, and from multiple different types of sleep tracking devices, which I think is an important point here. So this data set was aggregated into 7.4 million nightly sleep observations. 47,628 adults were included from 68 different countries around the world. And as you can see here, it's important to point out that this data set is by no means representative of the human population. So just like the distribution of weather stations on the planet, you can see that certain countries are more represented and other countries are less represented. One of the interesting things is that you can see sort of the heartbeat of human sleep patterns in this type of data. So this is just looking at individual level sleep deviations from what's normal for them. And you can see that there's seasonality, but also that people catch up on the weekends from sleep that they lose perhaps due to economic pressures, as Arun was alluding to during the work week. And we basically want to control for all of these location-specific temporal trends to understand what happens in a natural experiment if you're just randomly exposed to heat compared to how you would sleep in that exact same place without the heat exposure. And this is exactly what we're going to do. So we construct a planetary natural experiment. And the challenge here is that there are all these unobserved things that are happening both within us and around the world at the same time. And so we're going to control for things like seasonality. We're going to control for the fact that everyone has a different sleep baseline. So what is normal for one person for sleeping is going to be very different from someone else. We're quite idiosyncratic that way. And we're also going to control for other meteorological factors such as wind and rain and humidity, cloud cover, things that might change daylight that also is consequential for sleep. And we're also going to control for every single day of the study. So controlling for every global scale event, every day of the week, every sort of internationally celebrated holiday. And what we're left with is this natural experiment. So instead of randomly assigning people to different climates, we're just going to see how they sleep when they're exposed to these conditions compared to how they would when they are not. And what we find is that as we move across the temperature distribution, the hotter it is, the less that people sleep. And this is within person change. And what's really interesting is when nights exceed 10 degrees Celsius, the sleep loss per degree of warming becomes larger. And this was quite surprising because it also suggests that people are much better at adapting to cold temperatures than hot temperatures. We see that the probability of having a short night of sleep within individuals also increases, and it doesn't really matter what threshold you use. So if you use sort of a Japanese standard for short sleep or a US or North American sort of defined notion of short sleep, which is a little bit higher, in every case, we see that short sleep is amplified, no matter what the definition. And we also find some evidence of inequities. So we can see that the elderly is over twice as affected per degree of warming. We can see that females are significantly more affected compared to males, although the difference is quite small. And we can also see, I think very critically, that people who are living in lower income settings are over 3 times as affected per degree of warming. So they lose 3 times as much sleep per degree of warming. And so we could ask some basic questions. Arun also alluded to some of this too, like, do people just adapt because maybe they nap during the day or change their sleep structure? And what we find, at least at the global scale, is that no, we don't find evidence that people sleep more over a 24-hour period by catching up via naps. We actually see that they sleep even less if you look over 24 hours. We don't find that people catch up on lost sleep. So effects are cumulatively larger over the week. People don't gain back the sleep that they lose, they actually lose even more. And we find that over the course of the summer, people actually don't acclimatize that well. At the end of the summer, these unusually warm nights reduce sleep by even more. But what about in the long run? Like, don't people who just live in really hot areas intuitively or habitually adapt because they have, say, built up environments that are better equipped to deal with this nighttime heat? And surprisingly, we've found that no, actually, people who are already living in the hottest climates were over twice as impacted per degree of warming in terms of nighttime sleep loss. So taking this together, might climate change actually have implications for the sleep loss into the future? And so what we do is we combine this functional response that we see today already across a very extensive global area where people have adapted with things like air conditioning, et cetera, and we project this out into the future. And what we see is that basically sleep loss due to suboptimal nighttime temperatures is expected to increase in any scenario, but the magnitude of that increase really scales with the level of global greenhouse gas concentration. So higher emission scenarios basically lead to a lot greater risk in terms of nighttime sleep loss and the number of short nights of sleep that will be sustained on the global population. I think very importantly, we also see and find evidence of large spatial inequities. So the differential impacts between, say, the hottest climates and the coolest climates grow in magnitude according to the level of greenhouse gas concentration. So this also suggests that, the climate policies and actions that we take today may have direct implications for not only our sleep health, but the sleep health of future generations, and more importantly, the sort of equitable sleep impacts or the inequitable sleep landscape of the world. So in short, we find causal evidence that randomly timed periods of heat reduce sleep within individuals. And we also find, I think very importantly, that this impact is unevenly distributed, with the elderly, females, and people residing in lower income settings most impacted. And that sleep may be a really key mechanism that actually links these periods of heat with many of the physical, behavioral, and mental health outcomes that have been shown to also become heightened during those same periods of hot weather. And I think very critically, this is also potentially good news for policy, in that it provides a low-cost target for adaptation as long as it's equitably addressed. If air conditioning is provided in an equitable manner without just basically following the market, that could help to ensure that people have a cool night of slumber, as opposed to just the richest people who can afford air conditioning, heating up the outside environment even more for those who can't afford it. And it's very likely that our estimates in the study are actually quite conservative, because the sample is composed of more people from affluent countries. And we also see that the demographics that are less represented in the sample, even within the sample, are way more affected by higher nighttime temperatures. So I'm just going to leave you with this quote by William Gibson, the sort of famed sci-fi author of Neuromancer. But I think it's also important for us to reflect on that all imagined futures lacking recognition of anthropogenic climate change may increasingly seem absurdly short-sighted. Virtually the entire genre will be seen to have utterly missed the single most important thing that we were doing with technology. And with that, I'll turn it over to the next speaker.
Thanks so much, Kelton. That was brilliant. So our next speaker is Jayson Porter, who is the Voss Postdoctoral Research Associate in Environment and Society at Brown University. His research specializes in environmental politics, science and technology studies, food systems, and racial ecologies in Mexico and the Americas. Jayson is an editorial board member of the North American Congress for Latin America and the forthcoming journal Plant Perspectives, a staff blogger for Black Perspectives, and an environmental specialist for NORA Research Mexico and Central America program. Over to you, Jayson.
Hello. Can everybody hear me okay and see me okay? I hope so. Okay, awesome. Well, I should also mention that I in no way study sleep. I'm a historian like Professor Kumar, and I study agriculture primarily. And the reason why I'm here is because of a tweet that I sent out while I'm pretty sure that I'm assuming that's why I'm here, because a tweet that I sent out while I was teaching a course on graphic novels and journalism. We were working on we were reading a book on climate change, a graphic novel on climate change. And I just kind of asked the students what they thought about, we were just thinking, just imagining different ideas of the book was pretty grim and just different solutions to climate change. I mean, not necessarily, we were trying to mix the personal and the structure. We were doing a little thought experiment. And one of the things that I threw out there was what it would look like if, privileged people in the United States or privileged US citizens were to sleep more. Would that have an impact on greenhouse gas emissions? And I don't know what the numbers are to distinguish something from being viral or not, but a lot of people said things about it, and it took a lot of circles. And I heard from quite a few sources about that. And I have a really good friend also at Columbia working with neuroscientist Neda Namati, who does work on sleep and climate change and the history of sleep. So she kind of blends a lot of what the two last presentations we're talking about. But I'm here really to talk about kind of the where I was coming from in that tweet, kind of the anti-capitalist perspective that really is grounded in, I think, what a lot of is coming out in kind of Black feminist literature around rest as resistance, particularly thinking of Trisha Hersey's NAP ministry. But I particularly found it, I mean, this narrative is also in context of like degrowth and the 4-hour work week, and thinking about kind of how do we slow down to generally kind of use fewer fossil fuels. And I was really inspired by Jenny Odell's How to Do Nothing, Resisting the Attention Economy, when she really thinks about just the relationship between our everyday actions and kind of the structures in which we're in, not necessarily putting the burden on the person or the individual action to have an impact on climate change, but it really made me think about slowing down and being more thoughtful about kind of my own relationship with just energy consumption, but with structures like sleep, as Professor Kumar was talking about, with sleep and its relationship with like industrial capitalism, our kind of transition from biphasic forms of sleeping or polyphasic forms of sleeping to a more, one that's rooted into a bedroom that is really kind of an industrial phenomena in the way that we kind of know it today, that's situated around the individual sleeping in a space that's really geared not necessarily towards the family or collective kind of unit or space, but really towards recovery for the next day. So one thing I really want to talk about is today, or just in my little brief talk, and I'll hopefully not talk too much longer, is not necessarily how to do nothing or how to do less or how to sleep to impact climate change, but how to think about when to do nothing. So once we got to get to the point of how and why that matters, or why that might be beneficial to think about, and the personal relationships of the structural, like how can we think about going forward and thinking about when to do nothing? And I think it's really informative. So I'm just going to throw out a little thesis that Ned and I put together in just writings between the two of us. Is where's my thesis? Okay, our current relationship and understandings of sleep have shaped energy use patterns and climate change, and perhaps rethinking and relating to sleep differently could foment more healthful relationships with productivity, the environment, and other species. And we were kind of thinking also, like, how can we learn from perhaps other, how Netta really studies, and you guys really need to, I'll put her work in the chat later so you guys can follow up on them, but really kind of thinking about what is sleep and why do we sleep? And that's not obvious. I mean, for a long time we thought we slept to lower our metabolism and help preserve energy, but studies have shown that's not necessarily true. And it might be informative to think about kind of how other kind of a species sleep. So there was recently a study, I believe in Turkey, by Yildiz Institute, across 38 million homes, I believe. What would it look like if people went to bed 2 hours earlier? And I think it was something along the lines of 4,130 tons of CO2 emissions would not be released in Turkey every day, which is pretty significant. But they thought what was more important in their findings was really thinking about when are people using energy, because oftentimes people are using more energy when they sleep. This kind of came up in the last presentation about equitable air conditioning, which I think is such an interesting and powerful but controversial idea, right? That I would love to think about more, because oftentimes, especially during certain seasons, people actually use more energy while they're sleeping to air condition their homes, especially during the summer. I think the study around nighttime energy increases is just honestly just fascinating and brilliant, and I will be thinking about all day, and I just really feel like a gift to just be here and have heard that presentation among others. So I think there's some really serious implications around really thinking about when we sleep. And I think, as it's been mentioned in other presentations, the when we sleep is unevenly distributed. People of color, studies have shown, sleep less and are increasingly being impacted, not only because of climate change and sleeping less, but to sleep more poorly at night as well. So that's a super important thing to highlight. But I don't know. I'm a writer and I'm a historian, and I find myself really inspired by kind of more than human species perspectives, just kind of thinking about how the other animals and other species sleep. In the state that I study, the state of Guerrero in southern Mexico, there's a really interesting relationship between the environment and how it's been extracted, because it produces a lot of oil seed bearing plants, and it produces them because of the long dry season there. And one thing I think is really interesting about this is it helps me think about kind of the ecological relationship between kind of wintering periods, be it because the temperature increases or decreases rather, or because the dry season happens. So in the case of southern Mexico, where I study, it's because of the dry season happens, and that's when oil bearing plants put a lot more oil into their seeds. I'm thinking about the histories of cacao, the histories of which is chocolate, or the histories of coconuts, or the histories of sesame that come from these regions that produce very large yields of oil because of how those plants winter or go dormant or sleep, and produce those oils. And it helps me think about how different animals survive during the dry season because of their relationship with plants and they're kind of dormant in their sleeping period. You can think about it this way. The professor Susan Allport, she's a scholar of triglycerides, really nails this point really brilliantly, that essentially squirrels and bears and other mammals that hibernate during the winter, they would not be able to sleep on the leaves from alone, and they wouldn't be able to sleep on leaves of the summer. And largely that's because of the type of oil, the type of chemistry that changes during the wintering period. And and I'll just boil it down so I don't go into acronyms, but the omega-3s that are in leaves are very fast acting triglycerides that do very they do the speediest tasks in life, is what Susan Allport says. They catch the photons in different animals. They're in our hearts. They're in rattlesnake shakers. They're in sperm. They're in a lot of fast acting functions. However, during the wintering period, when the oils from leaves are transitioned into the seeds, they transition from omega-3s into omega-6s, which instead of being accelerant types of oils, they are storage forms of oils. And those actually allow for us to have a different relationship, not just with the environment and the plants, with our own sleep, right? And so I just right now am really just trying to draw in from inspiration from just how sleep is just kind of bigger than us and our own circadian rhythms, and how that's been shaped by capitalism. But it also how thinking about sleep more deeply can not only help us think about equitable justice for not only people experiencing these heat climates in the most tropical regions that are experiencing climate change in the most immediate ways and urgent ways, but also think about our own personal relationships with the environment and how to slow down and kind of achieve those mental health goals that have been alluded to in the past. So a lot of this is coming from someone who spends zero academic and professional time studying sleep, but thinks about it deeply to help me think about the relationship between plants, animals, and capitalism, and the reasons I study in Mexico. So thank you so much for your time. I'm truly inspired by everything I've heard so far, and I'm grateful for the invitations. Thank you so much. On to the next speaker.
Thanks so much, Jayson. That was very inspiring. Thank you. So our final speaker is Benjamin Reiss, who is the chair of English at Emory University. His book, Wild Nights, How Taming Sleep Created a Restless World, uses literary history and cultural analysis to contextualize and critique the norms and pressures that every sleeper struggles to accommodate. Over to you, Ben.
Hi, thanks everybody. So that last talk couldn't have possibly set me up any better. I didn't know Jayson Porter's tweet, but I want to suggest that there's not a simple answer to that question. If white people, I think you said if white people slept more, would that help mitigate climate change? And the one answer one might give to that. One answer is yes. Another answer is, well, it depends where they sleep and under what circumstances. And what I want to talk about has a lot of resonance with that tweet and that subject, and also a lot of other issues that you brought up about spatial configurations around sleep, private rooms, private sleeping. You mentioned about air conditioning and equitable access to air conditioning, but then air conditioning also contributes to climate change. And conditions of labor and commerce and capitalism. Sleep is implicated in these things, not in a one-way relationship. And you know, it's interesting. I gave a talk earlier to this group that part of what I'm going to say today elaborates on. But you know, one of the things, my starting points is that there, as we're starting to see exciting research into the relationship between climate change and sleep, and I've heard some amazing things today that I want to follow up on. It's generally imagined as a one-way relationship where there are people sleeping or trying to sleep, unable to sleep, and then there's this thing called climate change that typically makes it worse. And that's the problem, and that's the relationship, and that seems to be true in a million different and alarming ways. But what the question that I want to ask is it possible that human sleep impacts climate change, which is exactly the question that Jayson Porter was asking. What I want to say to start is that the social patterns of sleep can themselves contribute to what gets called environmental factors. Sasha Handley, who's a wonderful historian who I think is going to be presenting in a future salon, is doing really interesting study about resource use and in agricultural communities in 18th century England, and how different sleeping arrangements required different kinds of resources. And so you can see in that there's not a one-way relationship between environment and conditioning sleep. It can go the other way as well. And so if we consider the social organization of sleeping bodies within built spaces and the resources that are necessary to construct and maintain socially acceptable sleep patterns, sleep configurations, we can start to see a bidirectional link between sleep and the environment. So in other words, sleep can damage the environment just as much as the other way around. And I want to just show a couple of images here. A little whimsical, but they get to this. Can folks see my screen? I hope you can. So this first is an image that came in a newspaper article talking about a contemporary trend in real estate, where consumers increasingly, upper middle class suburban consumers are looking for homes that have two primary bedrooms with the bathroom, fancy bathrooms and walk-in closets and so on. And that is something that accelerates a process that, again, the last speaker was mentioning, which is this trend to sort of spread people out at night into separate chambers, and contributing to the supersizing of homes. I mean, this is homes like this are a fixture in suburban and exurban landscapes. And if you look at a picture like this, and you think about where people are sleeping in it, it's not just a question of where inside that structure they're sleeping, but where that structure is. And you think about where such houses are likely to be located and how much distance you would need to travel from a typical work environment to get there, and how much space needs to be between houses to create optimal conditions for rest, so that you're not disturbed by neighbors' noise and so on. You know, you get a sense of the extraordinary amount of resources that go into that particular kind of sleep, that fantasy ideal of sleep that is peddled to American consumers, and increasingly we're exporting this idea as well. So think about how much energy is needed to turn on and off the lights and the televisions and the vacuum cleaners and so on. And then what kind of energy resources needed to heat and cool these spaces, as well as to power and to heat and cool the vehicles that need to carry people from homes like this to and from their workplaces. And you get a sense that the fantasy ideal of bourgeois, typically white-coated sleep in this country is fantastically expensive and is highly resource extractive. So I want to focus a little bit on air conditioning, because it's a fascinating factor in this kind of two-way relationship between sleep and environmental impacts. A couple of speakers have talked about how the attraction to air conditioning is something that is, you know, it's increased by changes in climate, right? As the climate warms, air conditioning becomes, in some cases, a life-saving device, and yet air conditioning is also highly energy extractive. And so I did a kind of deep dive into the history of air conditioning, and I found out about how what started as a fringe technology that was used to cool, you know, a few Tony department stores in the 1930s and 1940s started to, you know, spread into movie theaters and more slowly into domestic spaces. And it's a fascinating story. And it's really becoming a dominant technology worldwide that is often linked to producing states of rest and wakefulness that are necessary to kind of be productive and effective workers. And the connections between social expectation for sleep, especially solitary human sleep, that is produced efficiently in one slot during the night, is really quite fascinating, and in some ways is racially coded as well. And I want to talk about how relations between body and thermal comfort have just a really kind of fascinating and sort of disturbing history. And you can see in these advertisements, that one of which I think was used to accompany announcements of this salon. I think it was Alex who sent me a couple of these things after the last time I spoke. Picture these kind of attractive white women sleeping either in ice cubes or in air-conditioned rooms. And it really helped to reinforce this idea that comfortable ways of sleeping were connected to a certain kind of life, a certain kind of class and status and racial ideas, and that has a deep history. And I want to just point to a few strands leading up to it. So I'm going to back up a little bit and talk about the notion of comfort. Comfort itself is not a neutral term. We think about, you know, in order to sleep, we need to be comfortable. And this is something that's self-evident. The first human ancestors that came out of trees started to build kind of softer spaces with leaves and grasses and so on to lie down. We need, in order to be horizontal at night for long periods, we need a kind of softened surface. And we know that in order to properly thermoregulate, external temperature has something to do with our ability to do that for extended periods of time. But I'm drawing on the historian John Crowley, who wrote a great essay in 1999 called The Sensibility of Comfort. And I learned from him that comfort changed meanings somewhere around the 18th century. That it used to mean providing a spiritual solace to people who were afflicted, you aid and comfort. But increasingly, the notion came to be attached to a physical relationship to products, things like umbrellas, fireplaces, divans, and especially bedding products. And bedding products proliferated during the Industrial Revolution and the accompanying global trade systems that were powered by colonialism and slavery. And today it's gone haywire. I mean, the trade in items of comfort associated with sleep is, a multi-gazillion dollar industry. And Crowley defines this newer meaning of comfort in relation to these products as a self-conscious satisfaction with the relationship between one's body and its immediate physical environment. And he shows that across the 18th and 19th centuries, it became a force that shaped arrangements for work, leisure, domestic activity, travel, and rest. The desire for comfort also yields a technological dependency that creates an increasing intolerance for discomfort. So the more you get used to soft bedding products and soundproof rooms and air conditioning and all of this kind of thing, the less tolerance you'll have for thermal variation and sounds of nature, whatever it is you're trying to distance yourself from. Comfort also became associated with ideals of Western civilization and with regimes of efficiency that fueled its industry. So comfortable sleeping came to mean sleeping in private on increasingly soft and customizable surfaces, and to sleep in any other way, to sleep in groups, to sleep on, out in the open air, to sleep in spaces that weren't private, was associated through the period of colonialism with so-called savage races who didn't sleep in the way that proper English or European colonizers did. And so comfort itself became a sort of ideal toward which a whole way of life powered by an industrial economy and a sense of racial superiority was geared. In 20th century Europe and North America, the same technologies that optimized factory conditions for the efficient and reliable production of goods also optimized the bodies of workers. So climate-controlled bodies that were rested and sweatless would run the machines, balance the books, and contribute to overall productivity without the discomforts and inefficiencies of non-standard equipment. Sleep was to be procured in a climate-controlled environment in order to fuel maximum productivity. So comfort itself then got fed back into the economic system. You needed to be comfortable in order to be a good worker and to sort of be economically successful. So by the 21st century, the consumerist drive for comfort, epitomized by a good night's sleep, was inarguably a factor driving technological dependency. And so what I want to suggest here is that sleeping and sleepless bodies are kind of like a two-way index of the linkage between sleep and anthropogenic climate change. So sleeplessness on one hand, as we've seen from a lot of the presentations, is a barometer for the ways in which climate change enters the body and disrupts its systems, while contemporary constructions of primate, thermally controlled, and comfortable sleep point to our society's nonstop entanglement with carbon-fueled technologies that produce discomfort on a global scale. So the more we become dependent on air conditioning in order to produce this sleep, the more we're creating the discomfort that requires more use of air conditioning. And we see this happening in particularly the hottest regions of the world where air conditioning use is exploding. Going back to the mid-20th century, some of the earliest successes in domestic air conditioning were for electrically cooled beds, machines that cooled canopied beds and the like. So why was there such a fixation on sleeping on climate control for sleeping accommodations? The air conditioning magnate Willis Carrier of Carrier Air in 1939 described a condition that I think a lot of us would recognize as dominant in our world today. And he predicted that one day the average businessman will rise pleasantly refreshed, having slept in an air-conditioned room. He will travel in an air-conditioned train and toil in an air-conditioned office. So that it points to the linkage between sleep, labor expectations, but also to a linkage between transportation, sleep, work commutes, and the arrangements of domestic living in a kind of entanglement where it's hard to figure out like which is causing the disturbance and which is causing the resource use. Just a few more words about the racial dimensions of this as well, because it does build a lot on what the previous speaker was talking about. So I tried to show in my book, Wild Nights, how particular kinds of sleeping configurations became associated with whiteness and economic success. So sleeping in private, solitary sleep for children, managing one's sleep efficiently at night, avoiding naps and the like were associated with European or implicitly with white character traits and behaviors. This kind of ideal of privatized sleep and unbroken sleep, the idea of doing all of one sleeping at once at night, is becoming a kind of globalized standard in many regions outside of Europe and North America. But in the United States, immigrants from non-European nations, particularly Black and brown people, often arrive with different expectations about sleep, which are frequently coded as backward or even immoral. And of course, poor people can't afford the spatial and temporal configurations that I showed earlier, those houses where everybody's spread out in this way that is associated with the bourgeois ideal. Poor people can't afford the spatial and temporal configurations that allow for the optimization of sleep in this way. And their failure to achieve that kind of sleep only compounds their social disadvantage. So I traced the history of some of these developments in my book, but I just want to add a thermal dimension to this, and then I'll close. But so just as spatial configurations for sleepers became a matter of class-based racial and national distinctions, so too ideas about thermal comfort became over several centuries associated with whiteness and civilization. So stretching back to the 18th century, scientists used climatic differences to explain race itself. Different skin tones were created by exposure to the sun and to heat in the 18th century theories. And they often associated proclivities that were supposedly attached to these distinctions with a climatically shaped hierarchy of races, with skin tones associated with temperate or cool zones, lighter skin tones on top. People of color were presumed to be, because they had more exposure to sun, that was said to produce laziness or difficulty in concentrating and thinking, and it created obstacles to productivity. The influential geographer Ellsworth Huntington concluded in his book, Civilization and Climate, written in 1915, that physical activity is most effectively accomplished when the daily average temperature falls between 60 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit, just the temperature you might cool a room to. And mental work flourishes when the average temperature, presumably outdoors, is just 38 degrees. As air conditioning was introduced as a mass-marketed commodity in the mid-20th centuries, advertisements often drew implicitly on this legacy. So I'll quote one that ran, "Why have most great inventions and advances in science and industry come from temperate zones? Because for centuries," it answered itself, "tropical heat has robbed men of energy and ambition. There was no air conditioning, so they took siestas. So I just want to conclude by saying that when we think about sleep in relation to climate change, we're not talking about static categories. Climate change is one thing, sleep is another thing. Just as contemporary expectations around sleep have deep and conflicted histories, so do ideas about what the climate is and how it shapes human behavior, human identity, and so on. And same with ideas about comfort. So I'll just close by saying, it's really in this sort of unstable relationship, it's I think a temptation to say that there's an actor and an agent. There's a climate and there's a person trying to sleep, and the one is acting on the other, but not the other way around. So I would just encourage, further thought about the ways in which all of these categories, sleep, climate, comfort, are unstable and in interactive relationships with one another. Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much. That was brilliant. Yeah, it really brought together a lot of the kind of questions and issues that other people also raised, but kind of turning around, which was brilliant. So thanks so much again to all of our wonderful speakers. So obviously we've got some time for questions. Whilst people think a little bit about what they might want to ask and either pop it in the chat or perhaps just raise their hands, I'm going to kick us off with a kind of general question to the whole panel, if that's okay. So one of the things that obviously a kind of thread throughout many of the talks we've heard tonight was this idea of sleep and climate inequality. So inequality was really a key kind of theme for all the papers, really. The violence of sleep, as Arun puts it, which is also, of course, the violence of the climate crisis, and both are very much unequally distributed. So I'm wondering perhaps how we could turn maybe this conversation around a little bit from inequality to justice. So sleep justice, climate justice, whether you've got any thoughts on what the pockets for hope may be, potentially, to put it in a frame that is very dear to me as somebody who works a lot on utopias and dystopias. So yes, is there a way to turn the conversation around to justice, both in terms of sleep justice and climate justice? And this is a question for everybody on the panel. Feel free to just jump in.
Hi, I think I could jump in just to start things off. Thanks to the panel. I really enjoyed listening. I've taken lots of notes. One of the things I wanted to talk about, in addition to sort of having sort of an academic part of this piece, I'm also part of sort of a grassroots organization called Starfish that's trying to build, trying to contest the operation of this mine. And so that's involved things like letter writing, around the mine and linking sort of health and sleep. So letter writing, we put in an official appeal to the Nova Scotia government to try to revoke the permit, which has been extended for 9 years, I believe it is, 7 to 9 years of more of this mine operating. And sort of one of the things that this sort of advocacy work has sort of really shown is how hard it is to do that kind of work in a place where mythologies around coal and are really strong. And so that's sort of what I'll start sort of just by throwing that out there to the panel.
Great, thank you. Anybody else has any thoughts on this, perhaps? Yeah, Jayson, feel free to jump in.
I'll say something that's not as it's definitely community driven, similar to the last example, but in a different way. And I had no idea I never really connected this. I would have never called this sleep justice. And I don't even know if it's sleep justice now, but it's just something I did yesterday. We'll call it that. What's something I did yesterday is what we'll call it. But yesterday I was working with a good friend and paleoclimatologist from Colombia. We were working with a group of fifth graders in South Providence, all Black and brown. Part of the class was even bilingual. It was very cool. But basically, we're talking about climate histories and how we can tell histories in the past of climate with inequalities like capitalism, like colonialism, like heteropatriarchy, like white supremacy, like the global production of knowledge that comes from a lot of the temperate zones that we're speaking from right now, from our different spaces. But there's also other structural elements. So one, we were talking about actually the dormancy of trees. So the fact that a tree ring, which is something that is used in temperate zones to demarcate change over time, is something that is caused by the vascular Cambrian growth tissue actually going dormant or actually stopping during the wintering period. So without a wintering period, you don't have a tree ring to demarcate time, which means that in tropical regions, you have to find other terrestrial archives to some extent based in plant material to tell change over time, because that doesn't exist. And I think what another problematic thing is that something like tree rings, something that is the manifestation of sleep in a temperate zone, is something that, because of the global supremacy of global North and education coming from these schools, something like tree rings being something to tell change over time is something that becomes normative, right? It's something that people assume is something that happened in the tropics, which when we asked the kids about it, they had no idea. I didn't learn that until very late in life. So I just wanted to throw that out there just to keep on my trajectory of plant-based commentary. But I appreciate the question. I think learning that at a young age, and it really connects to some of the points that Benjamin was making about just kind of the ongoing colonial present of the temperate North.
That's great. Thank you, Jayson. And I was actually going to ask you about plants. So there you go. I'm very happy you you went there. Anybody else on the planet? On the planet, on the planet, I don't know, on the panel.
Yeah, I'll just say that, this is a justice issue that maybe doesn't seem as like as much a matter of direct action as some of what the last two speakers were talking about, but it's really interesting to see, and I've been a little bit of a part of some of these conversations within sleep research societies to really put equity and inequities on the table when we're talking about when we're talking about sleep and health consequences of disrupted sleep. It's kind of been slow to develop, as I understand, in a lot of the kind of health sciences research, and really putting that front and center in some of the academic studies is a justice issue too.
Thank you. Chandra, do you want to jump in? Because I see that you've got your hand raised.
Sure. Since you mentioned a utopian society as one of your foci, I thought, just fundamentally, if we could somehow focus on stopping exploitation, of course, of extraction of land, but also extraction of labor, of human bodies in order to extract the land. That will be like the fundamental necessity to, first of all, get to environments where we're aligned in terms of our circadian rhythms being aligned with environmental conditions. In order for that to be possible, we would need to operate in alignment with nature, and our very ideology, in my opinion, would have to change. Because, for instance, if you think about the United States, and the reason why these so-called leaders are going haywire is because they don't want people to think about how the very fabric of the society was built off of inequities, and you would have to completely reimagine and retrofit and all sorts of activities in order to get to an equitable society. So I think at the heart of the matter is exploitation of the land and human bodies. And until we change our belief in this hierarchical system, which is color coded, then, you know, anything else would just be a Band-Aid.
Thank you, Chandra. That was great. Yeah, thank you. And also in the chat, I see that Mary has commented, sleep is political, sleep access, sleep nutrition, sleep hygiene, and sleep science as potential things for us to think about. Oh yeah, Kelton.
Yeah, thanks so much. I just wanted to jump back in real quick to follow up on some points. And I think, you know, as much as we humans here, you know, on the stage today are discussing the implications and the sort of equity implications of a changing climate on sleep, it's also important to, I think, you know, think deeper about Jayson's point about other animals and sort of other organisms that might also not be able to advocate or track or even monitor and present that information to humans. And one of the things that we remarked at the end of conducting this global scale sleep study was, if we find these impacts for people who probably are pretty privileged and can, you know, afford technology and have connected wristbands and whatever, what might the impacts be for other animals that are, you know, potentially not equipped in the same way to adapt like humans are? And I think that, you know, opens up a really interesting sort of more than human discussion with regards to sleep equity. So, you know, I don't know if anyone has a follow-up to riff on that, but I think it's a really important point that we actually are largely in the dark about what these impacts are for other species.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was also thinking throughout what you were saying, but also what Chandra was saying, also the idea more broadly, just of the planet, like having time to regenerate and rest, right? That's also part of that kind of broader conversation that you were mentioning. So we got Arun. Do you want to jump in?
I just want to make a brief comment following the conversation that is happening, which is that I think you raised the question of sleep justice / climate justice. With regard to climate justice, the framing of that that climate justice is seen as a problem of nations, as a problem of countries and regions, and that's not the case with the sleep. Sleep, though it's a mass problem, it's a problem of individuals, and that's where the problem is. So to talk of sleep justice in the manner like climate justice there's this blocking which is happening, because the question, in my understanding, that there is a lot of like individualization of sleep problems, that if you got a problem with sleep, yes, that's your problem. It's not a society's problem, it's not a group's problem, it's not a nation's problem. While on the other hand, that may not be the case with the climate, the way it has been framed. And I think the way ahead is more and more studies kind of pushing this idea that the climate and the sleep and the class and the exploitation, labor exploitation, and also the historical inequalities that have accumulated over the period of time, whether through global migrations or forced labor migration or colonialism. That I think, though like a larger study, a greater number of study highlighting this as a kind of sleep as a wider problem, not as an individual problem, I think that's the way ahead, I feel.
Yes, absolutely. And obviously, I mean, I totally agree with you. And it's the whole idea of the neoliberalization of sleep itself, right? Which is obviously all about individualism and making also what is a systemic problem, very much the problem of the individual. We've got Jayson and then Sarah.
I was going to make a very, very quick point to just respond to Kelton's kind of question about kind of just sleep justice and a more than human perspective. Since a lot of your really awesome work has to do with kind of cities and kind of their impact on heat and how they compound this night increase, I think one kind of direction to look at could be, and you're probably already doing it because I think Netta at Columbia is doing this a little bit, is looking at light pollution, right? So light pollution is definitely something, we think about light pollution as keeping us from seeing the stars, but light pollution is something that is definitively impacting not only how animals sleep, particularly birds, particularly nocturnal animals, animals that have a circadian rhythm that's really dependent on their relationship and proximity to light, but a huge impact on migration patterns, especially of migratory birds, and how they live and die as they move to different places and are confused because of light pollution coming from these huge, gigantic megacities all over the place. So I think that's a huge kind of space to kind of think about how human climate change is directly impacting how animals sleep and move.
Thank you, Jayson. Sarah, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks. I'll just lower my hand here. I also wanted to say, Jayson, I saw your tweet as well. So it's cool to kind of be on this panel with you and see you. And I'm putting this question sort of to several people on the panel might be able to answer this. We talked a little bit about this idea of air conditioning and justice. And I'm wondering if there's sort of, if anybody's sort of thinking about the limits of technology for solving this. And what are some other ways that we might be thinking about it, as opposed to sort of falling into techno optimism here? Just how might different people on the panel sort of think about that sort of question?
Great, thank you. So we've got Kelton, who I suppose wants to address Jayson's point, and then we'll go back to Sarah's point and Sarah's question.
Yeah, just very briefly, I wanted to comment on this because I think also Benjamin raised some really excellent points about, the sort of two-sidedness of air conditioning. Here it is on one hand, a life-saving technology. On the other hand, it dumps waste heat into the surrounding environment for those less fortunate to afford it. And I think this is where, oftentimes there's kind of binary thinking when it comes to adaptation versus mitigation, but we really need to think as a part of that broader discussion of, climate justice and climate equity with regards to air conditioning, about how to actually integrate sustainable energy generation into, the sort of air conditioning buffer against heat stress. And, the irony is that if we don't do that, we will create a really odd situation that sounds almost sci-fi, where the richest segments of society will be dumping their waste heat, almost, if you could visualize it, like a soup of miasma out their windows and onto the streets, where those people who can't afford it are actually experiencing amplified heat and losing even more sleep. And at the same time, that electricity demand will actually amplify global warming at the planetary level, and in a very inequitable way, take more sleep from the segments of society and countries that are the least responsible historically for the global production of greenhouse gases. So I just wanted to, lay that kind of visual picture with regards to air conditioning. It's a complex relationship, but air conditioning is absolutely a life-saving technology as long as the energy system that supports it is also sustainable and not perpetuating inequities.
Thanks, Kelton. Jayson, is that a legacy hand, or did you want to jump in?
Nope, that was an old hand, sorry.
So what are people's thoughts on Sarah's question about how to go beyond effectively techno-optimism? Alana, yeah.
First of all, thanks everybody for amazing and really thoughtful talks. And I think partly in response to Sarah's question, but also something that I was hearing across all three is maybe more of a comment than a question, in a sense. How much do you think we also need to shift the conversation to working less as a species, as part of a response both to the sleep crisis and to the climate crisis? I'm struck by the need to make sleep predictable and homogenized, partly just to meet the demands of labor. And we talk about this a little bit in terms of, we've had some conversations about shifting the start of the school day. And I was really struck by Jayson's framing of when to do less. And I really think the when is often in terms of the demands of work. I wonder if there's been any research, for example, with the impact of increasingly hot nights on poor sleep, if one of the mitigation factors is around things like flexibility of labor responsibilities, flexible start times to work, being able to shift your working conditions to maybe also work less in the summer. I think in Canada, we think a lot about winter as the time of hibernation and doing less. I think we feel it in our bodies when it's very cold, but I also just wonder about, just the way we might need to rethink labor in relation to the link between these questions.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really crucial theme there. So thank you, Alana. Benjamin, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I did, and it actually what I wanted to say was anticipated by this last comment, and that is that thinking about, we might resist the dangers of techno-optimism, but I also want to resist the dangers of sleep optimism. And when Jayson was talking about, well, sleeping more might be the solution, to kind of slowing down and being less productive, maybe. But I want to recommend Sarah Sharma's book in the meantime that talks about the slow movement and the attractiveness of doing nothing and resting and slowing down as a way to consume less. But there's some complications there. For some people to be able to slow down and take it easy and relax, it often requires other people to work even harder. And also if we're slowing down and relaxing, we're often kind of attracted to spaces that are hard to get to and require a lot of resources to maintain. So slowing down it's not a catch-all. Sleeping more isn't like necessarily you might feel good about consuming less or producing less or something, or being off grid, but it's got to be more structural than this individual neoliberal response of like, well, I'm going to do my part. So sleep optimism, and if you look at like Jonathan Crary's book, which got a lot of attention and is a fascinating book, it kind of feeds into this a little bit that like sleep is the place that capitalism doesn't touch. I mean, and I think really sleep is the place where capitalism is all over it. So we've got to think about what we mean by slowing down, by resting, by working less. Who's the we, and really what conditions are necessary in order to be able to pursue that.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I may just recommend, so there's this play by an Australian playwright that some of you might have heard of, which is called Hibernation by Finnegan Crookmeyer, who basically imagines, and I mean, I'm not going to spoil it, but basically the premise is that as a response to climate change, the whole kind of world population is put into hibernation. But the beauty of that play, so it's basically what Benjamin was suggesting, right? This idea that sleep could be the answer. But then the author brilliantly complicates this idea by thinking about issues of inequality and equity. So perhaps something, a reading suggestion for people who may be interested, Hibernation by Finnegan Crookmeyer. Jayson, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, another animal thing. So in a study of 30 primates, I think it found that humans sleep more than all other primates. And the general reason for this, scholars have kind of deduced is predation, right? We don't have predators, but we do, capitalism, industrialization, climate change. But we don't have predators that'll eat us in our sleep. So we reach deeper sleep faster. So we have a deeper sleep. So we sleep longer and deeper. I think this is interesting to think about, because we talked a little about it, how to do nothing and where when to do nothing. And I think it's also important to think about where to do nothing. So I'm thinking about in the South, where I went to school, in Mississippi, there's a history of people sleeping on porches, you know? And I think sleeping on porches, and maybe this is a dystopic kind of imagination I'm just kind of throwing out there. Chandra had kind of, mentioned that, can we dream, with each other kind of thing, And so maybe we can dream about life on porches, because I think sleeping on a porch requires community and trust. And I think something that, and I think if we live in a society where we don't have to, we really don't have predators, we really don't have to worry about each other, not having each other's best interests, then we can really start to sleep on the porch, at the right time. What Aristotle said, there is no good. Good is the right time, at the right place, the right person, right? So maybe sleep is the right time, the right place, the right, the right, kind of right environment, right? And, maybe that would be, being able to sleep on our porch. But I think that changes our relationship with one another, how we trust each other, how we love each other, and how we build community.
Thank you, Jayson, for that brilliant utopian note. Anybody else have any questions? Obviously, please, people in the audience, feel free to jump in at any point. The floor is very much open to your questions as well. Yeah, people are loving the idea of the porch, which is great. Does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask the panel?
I was just going to say, Devon has some really maybe interesting things to say potentially around that links to Benjamin Reiss's stuff around comfort and sound. I'm not sure, Devon, if you wanted to add anything there, because I think that's one of the things that you've sort of really brought to the project that we're talking a little bit about. If you wanted any comments there.
More questions and inspirations than comments at this point. I've written so many notes. But yeah, this idea of technological dependence is something that I'm really fascinated in figuring out more, where that's coming, which is what you've been talking about, and also what to do about it in terms of, is it this feedback loop this rabbit hole that doesn't have a bottom, insofar as, do we just build up more technological dependencies over time, and where does that end? And are those technological dependencies addictive or necessary? And I think there's a very fine line between those two things. I'm looking at it more in the sense of media, how we increasingly use media as a form of sleep aid, as opposed to a tool for consuming information. And and just seeing how extractive capitalism sort of dilutes all things, even information in media. And relating that back to climate change is also an interesting thing that I'd never thought about, frankly, for my own research, but just this idea of sleeping more, it's not a 1-to-1 ratio, but sleeping more might mean less heat emitted, and the connection between heat and heat emission and how we use media is a really fascinating question that I look forward to thinking about more.
Thank you, Devon. So we've got just a few minutes left. So if anybody, Chandra, please.
Sure. So I was hesitant because it's a half-baked response, because it's one of those questions where, of course, I think you'd want to ponder over it in terms of technology. But I do think that if you think about the technology that we do create, and using the term broadly, so if it were medications, that humans have developed to quell some ailment, right? You can consider that a technology, for instance, but it has side effects, because we are also just human and we don't like understand every facet of nature and their consequences to like perturbing certain pathways. And that's how I feel about technology coming from humans, because even the technology we use literally for firearms, that's because we have the ideology of fear where we need to protect ourselves from each other because somebody's going to prey on you. Therefore, we can't sleep on our porches because people have, or can't go to school now because people have firearms. That's a technology that we built. This machine learning is like, it can only be but so beneficial because, you know, the whole idea of garbage in, garbage out. The machine learning is using data that humans sort of developed or collected. And if it's garbage data, the output will be garbage. And so I think we as humans need to identify our like fundamental limitations. Like if you take light as an example, we can't see like the full spectrum of light. We see a very tiny fraction, and we're relying on our intelligence to create technology. Is limited. So I think we have to take a step back, just in my opinion, and again, focus on work that is aligned with the laws of nature, which is the opposite of what we currently do. But I think there's no technology that can overcome us living like we're a mere manifestation of the environment and not here to dominate it.
Thank you, Chandra. Oh yeah, and Alana has just put in the chat a relevant piece. But yes, Chandra, that was absolutely wonderful, and it went back to this idea that Sarah was also telling us about, right? Going beyond this idea of techno-optimism. So I think that there's a lot of convergences there between your 2 points. Does anybody from the panel want to perhaps answer Chandra's provocations in any way? Any thoughts? Otherwise, we're almost done with time. So unless there are any kind of final observations, final burning questions or observations that people want to make, feel free to raise your virtual hand. Yes, so Alana's put in the chat the link to the sociability of sleep. So yes, obviously, please do visit the website and connect with Alana, Alex, and the rest of the team. But yes, I just want to say thanks so much again to our wonderful panelists. The talks were really brilliantly rich. I certainly learned a lot and was very much inspired. So thank you so much. And thank you also to our audience. And Alana, I don't know if you want to say something to close, or...
I just wanted to say thank you so much, Diletta, and thank you to all of our panelists and our audience for a great conversation. I did put the link to the website in the chat. We do have some open calls for papers and calls for participants, and we hope to find lots of ways to continue this conversation as well.
Thank you. And yes, have a wonderful rest of the day or night, depending on where you are. Thanks so much again, and happy World Sleep Day, as Alex said. Take care.
You take care.
Bye.